first point to make is that the concept of style had to be reintroduced and reinvigorated because it was debased and forgotten. And during the 20th century, because of the proliferation of historicism and various retro styles in the 19th century, 20th century was anti-style, although modernism can be considered and should be considered as one of the great epochal styles. And Philip Johnson and Hitchcock Russell were actually reintroducing that concept, but only to some extent successful, perhaps not successful enough, with the book The International Style, which also coincided with the show at MoMA at the same time. And I'm referring to this attempt of reinvigorating the concept of style for architecture. And what we're really talking about is, when we talk about epochal styles, are great paradigms of the disciplines through which the discipline is at each epoch, that means socio-economic epoch or stage of civilization, is readapting and rethinking the contribution of the built environment and of design relative to these epochs, because these different historical epochs of the development of civilization and the evolution of civilization are so radically different that they require different conceptions of space, different methodologies of design, a different conception of the social function of the built environment. So the first point was for me to reinvigorate this concept of style. It is not something only to do with superficial appearances. That has been the connotations of that concept more recently. And to bring a concept back which was an important contributor to the progress of the discipline was very important. And to stake the claim for the contemporary movement of parametricism, that convergence of a whole generation of young talent, enthusiastic, skillful, bright talent, cohering behind a series of values, methods, aesthetic principles, that had to be called a style, still an avant-garde style. So I say styles are design research programs. They're not just about appearances, they're about methodologies, about agendas of research. But they then have the ambition to become epochal styles in the sense that they determine the physiognomy of the built environment once the totality of the discipline would have subscribed to particular heuristics, a particular set of values, like modernism was a global movement in the 20th century. And if I look at the great lineage of styles, I'm starting with the Gothic as a transition from tradition-bound building into architecture, and then we go into the Renaissance, the Baroque, Neoclassicism, Historicism, Modernism, and then for the 21st century it is Parametricism. And some of those movements of the 70s, that period of transition, and 80s, which is deconstructivism, postmodernism, these were transitional movements. Like the movement from historicism into modernism had transitional movements like the Art Nouveau. It had also partial adaptations to modernism like Art Deco. These are styles which are certainly not epochal styles. So Art Nouveau was only a decade. Art Deco was kind of another decade and something rather trivial. Modernism was a full-on half a century, transforming the physiognomy of this planet, not only in terms of urbanism, architecture, but also product design and the world of artifacts. Now, the same I predict for parametricism, and that's why we have to move from an avant-garde movement into a mainstream global best practice. I just want to say one more word about it. What is so different about parametricism as against modernism and against, in fact, all prior approaches to architecture is really a very radical transformation of the repertoire and of the values which are brought about through computational processes, fundamentally, and the new opportunities on the one hand. On the other hand, the new challenges of a very, very different society, which I call post-Fordist network society. So I'm trying to, when I talk about parametricism, I'm emphasizing the fact that all elements of architecture, which has been the stable Euclidean geometric solids for 5,000 years, become parametrically variable, they become fluid, and therefore they become adaptive to each other when they're arranged in compositions and complexes, and they're malleable enough to also adapt into existing environments and contexts. So this parametric variability of the elements is the one important definition. How to then work on it is that when we have series and systems of these elements, they are supposed to be and should be and will always be varied rather than repetitive. We then have multiples of these systems rather than remaining indifferent. They will start to associate with each other and get into correlations with each other. These are the three principles, kind of malleable and variable, primitive, the way it proliferates into differentiated systems, and the way these differentiated systems correlate with each other. These were in an abstract sense, and you can see they're very abstract principles, leave an enormous amount of openness and freedom for various authors and subsidiary styles to be developed under this new global epochal trajectory of research and hopefully mainstream implementation. I mean, you can see in a firm like Started Architects, in the last 20 years we moved from a handful of 4 or 5 people to 450, nearly 500 people now, with a global reach and projects of all program categories and in all continents. That's just the tip of the iceberg, I would argue, for what's coming. And we shouldn't get distracted by the last few years of global economic slowdown. That has also slowed down this movement and had led to some of its protagonists to lose nerve, perhaps, and question this enterprise. I'm not one of those. Somebody like Lars Beiber perhaps has kind of lost nerve and stopped. I know other characters at the AA who've kind of withdrawn their ambitions and become more traditionally oriented. And there's this kind of retro backlash. Again, the modernism reappears under the heading of minimalism, and where blatant historicism is also reappearing. So I think these are phenomena of a kind of temporary slowdown in socioeconomic progress due to financial crisis and due to certain imbalances in the world economic system. They don't really question the overall trajectory of the world civilization in terms of moving from a mechanical paradigm of mass reproduction, which is Fordism, tied up with modernism as architecture, to a much more fluid, dynamic, microelectronically based, robotic based civilization, which is the post-Fordist network society, where everything becomes fluid, interactive, where communication spreads and differentiates a much more complex built environment. And that is a condition we have to address, and there's no way of going back to a kind of mechanical/modernist paradigm. We have research efforts at schools of architecture, and we have small avant-garde companies who are doing research primarily rather than big projects. Maybe they're doing small experimental projects, exhibitions, installations. We teach. So there's a kind of avant-garde arena which is research-based and some smaller manifesto projects belong to the avant-garde. Some of our projects, even though they are special projects like museums and opera houses, etc., belong to kind of domain of the avant-garde. They're kind of manifesto projects. Now, I'm very conscious when saying we need to push beyond that. We have been at this and developing that style, this methodology, these set of values for 15 to 20 years, and it's really the push has to come now. If you think back at modernism, modernism was invented and created, and it was in the early 1920s through institutions like the Bauhaus, and it addressed also all the elements of urbanism, architecture, interior design, product design. And then there was a decade of research all the way through the 1920s, at the end of which you had small manifesto buildings like the Villa Savoye, the Barcelona Pavilion. So after one decade of research, you started to have these kind of manifesto buildings, smaller buildings. And then it took, a lot of the 30s was rolling that out beyond France and Germany into Italy, and it spilled over to America from the 30s. Unfortunately, we had the World War interrupting somehow that. And then in post-war it really picked up and transformed the world. So after about 15, 20 years of research, this style and movement was ready to proliferate globally and become global best practice. After 15, 20 years of research, modernism was ready, and we are ready in terms of parametricism, style and movement and paradigm, and we just start to win in more and more competitions. We have now projects completed, large-scale commercial projects with all the general building blocks of a city, with cultural elements, residential elements, retail elements, work elements, mixed-use complexes in major cities starting to be built. That's no longer avant-garde, that's showing global best practice, that's showing it does not only point beyond itself, but it is already arriving as a high-performance built environment. So that's where we are at the cusp of going mainstream. If the rest of the profession, the younger protagonists, obviously, that's who we are counting on, who are working in this way already, maturing and claiming projects, winning commissions. And we see that happening in China, and there's a lot of architects already in their 30s building successful projects there. In the mature countries in America and Europe, it takes maybe a little longer for a young architect to build that reputation and compete. But I think it will happen. So that's my vision, a total takeover of parametricism with respect to becoming the global best practice in terms of being context sensitive, the best way of picking up the ecological challenge through adaptive morphologies, not only through machines but through architectural morphologies and passive systems. And in particular, most importantly, to pick up that challenge coming from the new social dynamics and institutions, which mean multiple audience coming in close proximity, wanting to have many experiences in a short period of time, stimulating communications, information gathering, in an environment which I call information-dense environments. Very dense, very rich, highly articulated, complex, three-dimensional environments, like our Galaxy project, for instance, where you step into a project and you have vistas and views above, below, all around in layers, and you see literally 50, 100, 150 destinations to choose from, and you're navigating a three-dimensional field where you can make choices and see so many things. It's like an interface of communication and orientation, navigation, which brings so many choices and social situations into view and and gathers people in circumstances of intense communication and exchange. So, yeah, I was just talking about the need to bring this research agenda into a mainstream global best practice. And that means also we need to deepen that research and prepare that transition. We need to move, to rehearse the steps we've gone through. We've started with formal play, playing around with algorithms, with complex geometries. Then we started to impose a series of performance criteria on these forms. We brought them into scale, we brought in structure, we brought in fabrication logics, a series of moves disciplining, turning playful forms into constructs and spaces. But now it is also time to more critically rethink what these new geometries, complex compositions mean sociologically, why society requires this level of complexity. I mean, we've always argued that, we've hinted at that, but didn't have a way of working on that convincingly with new methods and computational methods. And that's where I'm coming in with now arguing for the need to upgrade the representation of social processes of occupation and bring that into the design model through crowd modeling, and deliver on the promise that parametricism is not only a new methodology for generating form, but also a new paradigm of understanding social function. And instead of having a simple list of labels that denotate or designate stereotypical types of spaces like, you know, lobby and lecture hall or living room, bedroom, kitchen, these or categories like office space, meeting room, etc. There's always only a handful of categories and they bring up images of a stereotypical solution. This kind of way of working just with labeling rooms and spaces doesn't get at the heart of that new dynamism of occupation where multiple audiences coalesce, where events grow and shrink or have a kind of homeostatic equilibrium with people coming, going, simultaneous events bleeding into each other, the blurring of boundaries. We can do that formally, but what does it mean? We can't just write in labels again to demonstrate how that is productive for this kind of very complex choreography of social life which we now face, where the distinction between work, entertainment, leisure, learning, etc., where these categories break down, where the boundaries of companies bleed into each other, where there's external consultants fusing into corporate territories. All this means a much more dynamic and fluid interaction between participants of the communication process, and that can now be modeled through crowd modeling, through agent-based crowd modeling. Really we're thinking through about the rules of occupying space, the rules of communicating in space, of interacting in space, and how these rules of interaction depend on where interactions take place. So the spatial ordering of patterns of interaction is something we can now work on by making agent behavior dependent on location and spatial morphology, atmosphere, signals and signs which are embedded in the built environment. Thresholds, once crossed, would initiate kind of recalibration of behavioral patterns and then generate a new emergent event type beyond that threshold. That is the real social meaning of the built environment, can be modeled, can be worked on through agent-based modeling. That's my new research program, which is very pertinent and comes in time when this way of working goes mainstream and becomes compelling and convincing for clients who would recognize that their institutional processes have that kind of fluid character rather than being described properly by 3 or 4 or 5 categories listed in a schedule of accommodation or pasted as labels into plans. So that's very important. And the way I'm developing this is not only a kind of quasi-physical crowd modeling, which is about density of crowd, throughput of circulatory crowds. These are called engineering crowds, but crowds and actors in space, in fact, communicative actors, understanding the space not as a container to be pushed into and through. That's not the way we occupy space, but actors and agents who recognize in a spatial setting an invitation to participate in a particular communicative scenario, and that invitation, that space, is itself communication. It communicates to everybody an expectation, a rule of engagement, which then coordinates actors into meaningful interactions. And that happens spontaneously, always, all the time anyway, but in a kind of haphazard and unpredicted way, and we as experts of orchestrating the built environment, we need to understand what is really happening. We should not focus our energy on accidental features or be fetishistically invested in a certain aesthetic appearance. We need to analyze what is the sociological drive of our clients' life processes, and we need to bring our ordering capacity strategically into play. And to some extent, every architect is doing that intuitively, but the discipline and the theory of architecture has not lived up to that, to explicating this. And so there is no pertinent theory of architecture which delivers the new repertoires and argues for the new methodologies with respect to mature understanding of the societal function of architecture as a discipline within contemporary civilization. So that is what I've been providing and working through in my book, The Autoverses of Architecture, in 2 volumes. The first volume is delivering a discourse analysis of the disciplines over the last 500 years with a focus on the contemporary, how the contemporary practice orders its processes through a series of categories and distinctions and how they have evolved. And in volume 2 I'm showing how we can go beyond that and have to upgrade and enhance our capacities, our concepts and methods and ways of working to be more adapted to and adapt with respect to post-Fordist network society. So this part is the cutting-edge research. This part is still to some extent speculative. Parametricism has achieved a lot, but in volume 2 I'm showing how parametricism becomes deepened to the point of being compelling as global best practice, which really has explicitly reflected and deepened engagement with contemporary societal processes. And the headline here is the refoundation of architectural semiology as agent-based parametric semiology. That has been the research I've been doing in using the teaching arenas initially, like the AA primarily, but also at Harvard, to some extent in Vienna, where I've been pushing this agenda and we also in parallel have started in some of our design architects competitions to work with that notion of a parametric semiology, but that has not been kind of brought to light yet in a mature project. When I sometimes lecture about the work of design architects, I can show glimpses and anticipations of a semiological approach, but not yet a fully fledged, compelling project. So I believe that with respect to my research agendas and what we're doing at AADRL, for instance, as well as the best work of design architects, does engage pertinently with contemporary network society, its dynamism, its multivalency, its multi-audience condition, the simultaneity of meanings, etc. And when we're talking about network society, we really imply that everybody needs to be in touch and connected with as many other collaborators, competitors, and influences, and that demands a totally new environment. Now, you referred to Mario Capo being critical of the discipline, of not having embraced the kind of logic of swarms, of crowdsourcing, of diffusing, letting work evolve in teams or in open source networks. And I would say some of this is in fact happening. The autopoiesis of architecture as the communication process of the discipline is a kind of global network where something we draw or students put online or something which has been lectured or said in a seminar in a crit is captured and sent through the net, invites commentary. So there is a kind of global network of communication to enhance the discipline. And I think there will be more and more of that, and the coming generation is very much open source. I think that Mario Capo got it wrong if he accuses the discipline as a whole to be kind of out of touch with it, kind of open source network way of production and kind of diffused conditions of authorship to some extent. I mean, the traditional architect as author is obviously still around, but what happens underneath that, let's say, marker or reference is very much kind of network process, and I don't think that we should think of open source and evolving collective enterprises as being authorless. Also in open source projects there is individual authors and their contributions are recognized to other contributors. The same as with something like Wikipedia. It's not that there is no sense of authorship there. There is, but even more so, I think that condition of individual authorship and individual contributions which gather into collective projects is something which will happen and is happening. And I don't think it's the death of the author or the authorless. It's a new understanding of authorship, and which could come partially collective, but not about abolishment of individual stances, contributions, point of views. I think that's what you find in all arenas of contemporary society, whether it's the sciences, the arts, various arts forms, the art system, the political system. You have political movements, but you have characters, voices, positions being articulated by individual politicians who stand behind their utterances with their name and reputation, and I think that is the contemporary condition. We have learned in kind of reflective discourse the lessons of the post-structuralist undermining of naive or mythical notions of authorship and genius, etc. But there is the social process of authoring and signing and taking responsibility is there, and it's also a very convenient form of referencing ideas. And so we are talking about authors with oeuvres. Of course, behind the architect as figurehead, as convenient reference to an oeuvre, are a series of sub-authors and members of staff and contributors, and they are not known to the general public, to larger audiences, because that will become too confusing, but they're known to an insider communication process. So it depends how deep and detailed you get engaged, the more you find authors and multiple authors and teams being uncovered behind the kind of reference point, which is the official author as it would appear in a mass media outlet. So that's where I would come in. You also reference Rem Koolhaas and its recent agenda at the Architecture Biennale, or forthcoming agenda for the Architecture Biennale, with respect to looking at the fundamental elements of architecture, which is very interesting, the way these elements have evolved historically. And I'm very curious how this will be displayed, dissected and elaborated. I mean, we have been invited now by Rem to contribute to some of these elements, for instance, the roof and the topic of the roof, and we have some extraordinary roofs to offer, and he's picked one or two unusual roof conditions from us. But the other subtext or theme, in fact, or prominent theme in the Biennale will be the idea or the question of the possibility of national architectures, or the disappearance, in fact, of national architectures, which Rem observes when he looks at the 100 years from 1914 to 2014. We, in fact, have the global transformation of the built environment through modernism, starting in the early 20s, and really in the post-war era, giving a total makeover of world built environments in all continents, on all scales, including design and artifacts. I mean, that's been amazing, and that's been an international style and movement, and it's been an international transformation. And since then, and now more than ever, architecture is a truly global discourse, and there's only world architecture. There's no longer national architectures. There were residues of national architectures still in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Still, when I was a student in the 80s, you had local heroes, local subsidiary styles. They were modernist, yes, and you had kind of local versions. Kind of talked about critical regionalism. That was an interesting idea, but in fact, these localisms were far less distinct than you had the 19th century, truly different national architectures, in particular in different continents and different civilizations you had radically different architectures and traditions. All that obviously has been eroded. We have residues of this which we cherish, the cultural heritage which is preserved, and I believe that as a document of history, and we still live in some of these structures, and even that is possible to some extent, like Rome. In Rome it was possible, the easiest because that is a kind of Baroque city or Renaissance Baroque city where you had only 4, 5, 6-story buildings, a dense build-up of structures which isn't so different from a kind of contemporary urban structure. So that was the beginning of modernity, and those early monuments to early modernity are still to some extent viable. In Asia and China, where you had a single-story carpet of hutongs, that was less viable to maintain and live in as a kind of full-on global city like Rome. So there was much more of a kind of transplantation of international models, global models, and the remaking of cities. And what is left of traditional architecture has more that kind of museum character, that kind of exceptional fringe character, not the real life process. Similar to Venice to some extent, where the real life process of contemporary Venice moved out onto a kind of city extension, and Venice itself becomes a place for tourism, a place for special events, culture, still part of life, but a kind of rarefied life. So my position with respect to all this is there's no point in being nostalgic about the preservation of old cultures. We can preserve their memory, their residues. We can preserve those life processes because of the level of productivity and, in fact, ultimately level of poverty which these life processes implied for the majority of people are no longer acceptable today. And there's global best practices in science, engineering, technology, in organization, in business organization, in professional procedures, administrative procedures, ways of working, which demand a certain sociology, a certain set of moral codes, a certain modes of communication, which are now global. I wouldn't even call them Western. That's because that phrase is only dissuading Eastern peoples from fully embracing and contributing to that modernization process, which is now truly global. And you have societies like Japan, who are, the most advanced societies, and contributing to that global process. And the same is happening to China now, India. These are Eastern peoples, if you like, but this distinction West-East is meaningless now, because all we're facing now is a world civilization with a global architecture, a world cinema, a world architecture, a world science, a world economy, a world political process, a world legal process with international institutions and so on. Of course, a global and world technology. So there's little room left for national or traditional cultures to flourish and become distinct. But what is happening is that we have a world division of labor where different regions and different centers and cities pick up different roles and therefore spawn different cultures. And sometimes in cities you have different cultures. You have a banking district, a business district with a financial industry, which is one kind of mode of interaction and culture, type of spaces. You have a media industry with a lot of artists and creatives, which is very different culture and different ways of modes of interaction. You have industrial manufacturing centers and regions which have yet another culture. So these are the different cultures which I would point to. You have university, you have research and science and universities, and those people have certain cultures which again they share globally. These are all global cultures which are distinct. So this multitude of global world cultures is what we're interested in. That's what parametricism can adapt to. What still remains regional is climatic conditions, which are very different and demand different morphologies. Environments where there's a lot of outdoor activity and outdoor spaces, and those where everything has to be indoors will be very different. Very harsh climates, cold climates will be different from very hot climates, again different from very humid and wet climates or very changeful conditions. All of this architecture has to be adaptive to and responsive to, and that's what we do with parametricism. In order to be ecologically light-footed in these environments, we need to really differentiate identities. So the differentiation of identities, which was lacking in modernism, where everything became homogeneous, which was still lacking in kind of a postmodernist era of collage urbanism, I nearly call it sometimes garbage-fill urbanism, where you have complexity and fragmentation, but everything a sameness of a fragmented visual chaos. What we're now talking about is creating new, strong identity, something which gives character and identity and recognizability to different places, cities and quarters within these cities, which we now can do with a kind of parametric setup where we pick up environmental climatic parameters, where we pick up some of these cultural interaction parameter differences between what a financial center would require, what a university complex would require versus a kind of manufacturing center. So these new forms of cultures and these climatic morphologies, if we allow them to be principled in their impacting a design process, a parametrically computationally driven design process, a rule-based design process, will deliver emergent typologies and formations which will have very distinct characters because they were driven from local conditions of topography, climate and culture, and they will be very different from that kind of sameness which we observe now as the outcome of a kind of global garbage-fill urbanism. So to step back and repeat it again and summarize it again, it's very important to recognize that national and traditional cultures are a thing of the past, that all cultures, and we're still talking of plural, are global, but that these global cultures are various and multiple, and that they will crystallize identities in different arenas of the world. And these identities will be then also become more unique relative to location, place, topography, when we add and build onto a historical city, into particular topography, with particular environmental conditions, and then have multiple world cultures, like the culture of business, bleeding into the culture of learning and science. And they could also start to intersect and interbleed, but they will also partly crystallize into their kind of domains. That's the picture of something which becomes much more navigable and legible. At the moment this happens to some extent already, but without having a registration in the built environment, because the architectural discipline has not allowed itself as of yet to generalize parametric design methodologies which could translate these patterns of cultural intercourse into parametric setups which will have urban morphology consequences which become recognizable. We hide all these nuances in that kind of sameness of a collage. If you look at a garbage spill, there are many different things in there. So there's a huge diversity and richness. But once it all kind of spilled and rolling down the hill, as it were, unordered, you'll get a sense of sameness. Even though the ingredients in each spill might be a little bit different, they cancel each other out into some kind of entropic white noise of sameness. Whereas what we're talking about is not allowing these differences to cancel each other out, but to potentiate each other, to coalesce into and build new identities with these. So that's, I think, a very, very important point where I feel, I don't know where Rem stands with respect to this discourse, whether he will be lament the disappearance of national architectures or just state it, would be more his style, I guess, with a kind of certain coolness as something which happened and we have to accept as a condition of the contemporary. I don't know. My position is, yes, we've lost these national identities. I am cool about it, the disappearance of these, but I am struggling and having found ways of and means to overcome that dysfunctionality of a kind of sameness soup, lack of identity soup of a garbage through urbanization. There we have methodologies to overcome that and to create places and urban identities which make sense and which communicate to audiences their character and invite audiences into their domains in a kind of differentiated language. So here, but not many people see that potential, because we get a lot of misunderstanding and criticism and rejection when we present our urban models and our architectures, because the deep rationality of what we're trying to achieve is not easy to be clarified. I mean, I have published 100 articles and written my big theoretical work, which runs in over 1,000 pages. I'm lecturing